All right, folks. Well, welcome. My name is Gianna. I'm the head of reference here at the Chelmsford Public Library. So happy to have you all here with us tonight for our next edition of Art on Thursdays presents Claude Monet, Impressions from Nature. Claude Monet was the founder of French Impressionism, a revolutionary style that involves working outside and rapidly executing sketchy paintings to capture momentary effects of light and shadow. Monet returned to familiar outdoor subjects throughout his career, culminating with his beloved series of water lilies in his garden in Giverny. This program traces the artist's life and career and includes many of his most beloved works. And of course, with us tonight, we have Jane O'Neill from I Am Culturally Curious. Jane O'Neill holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She is a New Hampshire native and has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane founded the Currier's Alzheimer's Cafe and led the tour program for the museum and the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Zimmerman House. She has taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at the New Hampshire Institute of Art. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it back over to Jane.
Thank you so much, Gianna, and thank you everybody for tuning in tonight. We're in for such a treat. It's almost unfathomable that we have not focused on Claude Monet yet together. We have such a wonderful arts loving community that meet together every month. So it's such a treat to kind of backtrack and go to one of sort of the most important people when it comes to Western art. So we will be delving into the work of Claude Monet tonight. He's the father of French Impressionism, of course. He led a nice long life and he had an extensive career during which he created about 2,500 paintings. And my challenge for tonight was really how do I present all of that in an interesting way? And I hope I've stumbled upon the solution for that for you this evening. So let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend our time together. We're going to get started with a very basic overview of what is Impressionism, just so we're all on the same page. We'll fly right through that, and then we'll do a quick introduction to Claude Monet, but we're really going to get to know him better through these later categories. First, friendship, then love, then his interest in light, and then the focus on flowers. And then we'll draw everything together in a nice bow at the end with the conclusion. So that should give us a really solid understanding of Claude Monet. By the end of this hour, it might inspire some travels and some further exploration of his works. But this will be your go-to primer on the father of French Impressionism. And this lovely painting here, we'll see more like it, of course, tonight. This particular work is from 1919. And with so many of Claude Monet's works, you have to go to Paris to see them. So there's the Musée Marmottan, which is a great place to see a lot of Monets when you're in France. And I know this is the kind of artist that can inspire you to cross an ocean. So let's get started with what is Impressionism. And I know most of you already know, but we're just going to sort of glide through this quick little review just so we're all on the same page. And I have two Claude Monet paintings right here on the screen for us. And they're a breath of fresh air, right? They're sort of our nice little primer for spring here in New England, too, for those of you that are joining us from New England tonight. We have the red boats from 1975 over here on the left, and on the right, the meadow with poplars. He's known for those famous poplars. This particular work is at the MFA in Boston. So when we're thinking about Impressionism as a style, it's instantly recognizable, right? It's all of these quick, short, visible brushstrokes. We see it in the field over here on the right. We see it in the sky in the brushstroke suggesting the rippling water over here on the left as well. And in addition to that, we have the light, bright color palette, these very pleasing vistas. There's something about all of these Impressionist artists that have the tendency to paint views that we are drawn to. And it's for that reason that it's really easy to forget that this was such a revolutionary style when it was first introduced in the 1860s and 70s. It was an absolute revolution in terms of picturing the world. So we're going to touch on that. And the revolution really began with these little tubes of paint. Who would imagine, right? So these are little collapsible tin tubes of paint that have a screw top to them. And if you've ever done any painting yourself, you've probably owned something like this before. And this is what an artist's art box would look like at the end of the 19th century. It would be filled with these little tubes of paint, your palette, and your paintbrushes. Now, prior to the invention of these little tin tubes, which I should mention were invented by a New Hampshire native named John Gough Brand. Um, Prior to this, artists were actually mixing most of their paint pigments either in glass or, believe it or not, in animal bladders. They did not travel well. So you can imagine artists were sort of anchored in their studios and really couldn't go outside. So once these little paint tubes were invented, there was freedom, there was liberation. Artists could go wherever they chose. They could go to rivers, they could go to fields, they could go outside to their gardens. And so we have this wonderful painting. We're so lucky that this painting is in America too, because it encapsulates so much of what Impressionism is. This work is at the Wadsworth Atheneum. It's painted by Auguste Renoir, and it's a portrait of Claude Monet painting outside in his garden. And so we have all of these essential elements of Impressionism right here. This important idea, namely, of painting outside, painting en plein air, as the French say. So here's Monet working with his little paint box down below, with his palette in his arms, on this tiny, spindly little easel, and a rather modestly sized canvas, too, that gives us the sense that these artists are outside trying to capture what they see. And that means they're looking at the modern world. And this is really a major shift in the history of art, where great art was always thought of as religious painting or history paintings, things that artists would slave away over in their studios for months, if not years. And now you have these impressionist artists, and again, these are two more Monet works, where where artists can go outside and show us what the world looks like, whether it's a beautiful seaside resort like this view of Trouville over here with the Grand Hotel and the fashionable ladies on the beach, or a busy Parisian boulevard over here where figures look like tiny little ants marching against this bright white of the boulevard itself here, and you get the sense of a flurry of movement and the vitality of the city in something like that. So we have this new sense of modernity when it comes to French Impressionism. But when it comes to Monet and most of the Impressionists in general, what we really have is this new interest in the momentary effects of light and shadow. And we get that over here in this Monet painting. It's a view of the banks of the Seine, and you sort of get this tree cut in half by shadow and light. And where it is illuminated by, it almost looks like the light at the end of the day, we can see these leaves that are lit up with greens and yellows. And then in the shadow, everything sort of falls to purples and blues over here. And so we have this new attention to momentary effects of light and shadow. And part of that is achieved by working outside, of course, and those collapsible tin tubes of paint. And over here we can see Monet's actual painter's palette, and the idea that he didn't even really have to spend time blending paints on his palette. As the 19th century wore on, there were more and more colors available. The chemists were hard at work producing these colors that were so vibrant that artists could literally just squeeze them out on their palettes and get to work and create a beautiful work like this one. And that leads us to this huge shift, the split with the past. So we're looking at two 19th century works here. This is the first half of the 19th century in broad brushstrokes, and then the second half over here. We've got our Monet on the right, and a work by the artist Jean-Dominique Eng on the left. over here. And I chose these two works because it's lovely ladies in their pink dresses. So it's this beautiful contrast between the old and the new here. In the first half of the 19th century, we have artists who are striving to capture in an illusionistic way all of the minute details of their subject. And especially when it comes to Aang, I mean, the silks and the laces and all of that are rendered so beautifully. They're intoxicating to look at. They're absolutely gorgeous. And then you even get the sense that maybe these are velvet pillows behind her. She's got the feathers in her hair. And then you look over at Monet's work and you can see every step of the way. He is just he's working quickly. He's using these very short brushstrokes, and he's not trying to blend these brushstrokes in any way to create the illusion of the textures that he's trying to render. So where we see the silk over here, we don't see the wood of the park bench that this woman's sitting on. Instead, we have the suggestion of light bouncing off of that that same park bench. So you can imagine, I mean, people were appalled by this change in painting. But Monet once said, "I want to paint the way a bird sings." And I love that quote. You can almost imagine his paintbrush like fluttering around the way the song of a bird sort of trills up and falls in the same way. I would contend that his painting even captures the world in a way that's closer to the way that we see things. So I'll give for an example. I have in my house wooden cabinetry in my kitchen, and I'm sure you all have wooden furniture somewhere in your homes. And I can look at the wooden cabinetry and understand that it's wooden, but I'd have to spend a lot of time with it to actually see and appreciate the beautiful grains of the wood, right? And Ang is giving us the equivalent of that beautiful grain in the wood that you would have to sit and study and really appreciate. Instead, Monet is giving us that first impression, that instinct that okay, there's wooden cabinetry here, and sort of dashing it off for us and illuminating these elements in the picture where the sun is sort of shining off of the background of the bench, etc. So he's giving us something that's closer to the approximation of quick glances around. And of course, the world is moving at a faster pace by this point in history, and it's moving faster than ever now. So I would say that his sense of how to capture the world at this time was in fact just so remarkable. It was really forward thinking. And he said, I tried to show what I saw in the most literal sense possible. So there's truth in all of this, I would say. And that leads us to what is the seminal impressionist work ever, the most important, the first one ever. This is the painting that gave birth to the movement. This is a view of this misty morning, um, where we see this orange sun coming up over the horizon, over the water here. And in the distance, we see suggestions of an industrial landscape, smokestacks, maybe some cranes, some boats. In the middle ground, on this kind of glassy water with just a few ripples in it, we have two silhouetted boats, but it's these brushstrokes in the water. It's the very loose peach paint up in the sky too, that are just rendered in such a remarkably modern way that that people kind of lost their mind when they saw this. This was exhibited in a show that is generally thought of as like the first impressionist exhibition. So it was Monet and colleagues. He named this work Impression Sunrise. The year was 1874. He had painted this, I think, just a few years earlier. But people were going to this exhibition to laugh at these paintings, to deride the work. There was one critic who's become famous now. His name was Louis Lavoie, and he wrote, "Wallpaper in its embryonic state is more labored than this seascape." He was the person who disparagingly took this term from Impression Sunrise and coined the term Impressionism. he used it disparagingly against these artists, and of course, they took it on as like their moniker as this budding movement here. Now, that being said, it was a long road to winning over audiences. In fact, the Impressionists exhibited again the following year, and the reaction to their paintings was still so filled with this vitriol and contempt that there was actually violence at that exhibition. The police had to be called. So the paintings, the ones that sold for very low prices, and all of these impressionist artists were essentially begging for loans to live on. This was a very tough time. They didn't just like swoop into to immediate success, but we are going to kind of swoop in that direction. Just for this quick summary here, we're looking at one of Claude Monet's paintings of haystacks. It would take about another decade or so before the Impressionists were accepted, before they were completely celebrated in French culture and beyond. And of course, the style has just traveled around the globe now, and it has influenced countless artists. And Claude Monet was always really seen as the leader of this movement. He's still ranked today as one of the most important and beloved artists of all time. He's right up there with like Michelangelo and Picasso and Rembrandt. And his work is very well represented on the list of the most expensive works ever sold at auction. This would be his most expensive work ever sold at auction. In 2019, it was sold for the equivalent of $131 million in today's money. So clearly still very desirable, still very collectible too. We'll find out in just a little while why you might not want to buy just one of these too. So let's turn our focus more specifically to Claude Monet himself. We've got our understanding of Impressionism here. Let's get better acquainted with the man who started this artistic revolution. This is a very short encapsulation of his life because we'll be covering a lot of it as we move through the program tonight. We are looking at a photograph of Oscar Claude Monet when he was about 18 years old. He was born in 1840, and he was called Oscar to distinguish him from his father, who was also called Claude Monet. We're looking at this great map here, and you can find maps like this all over the internet conveniently because there are a lot of river cruises that are inspired by the life of Claude Monet. And what we will see is that his whole life was kind of organized around the River Seine in France. So he was raised at the mouth of this river at this big port city called Le Havre. And of course, we have Paris sort of at the other end of this map, but we will be visiting Giverny and Rouen and several other places over the course of the evening. So maybe after all of this, we should all just probably hop on one of those river cruises together and get a little bit better acquainted with him. Okay, so he grew up in this port city. His mother encouraged his artistic talent. She was really supportive and interested. His father was dismissive. He wanted his son to go into the grocery business just like he did. And you get this sense that Monet's family was always very concerned about their status, that they wanted him to have a reputable job and a reputable life. So it was really his widowed, childless aunt who kind of took over and helped to oversee his path. And she thought, if you want to be an artist, we need to get you some formal training. So she even ensured that as a young man, he would go to the Louvre Museum, travel, from Le Havre down to Paris, go see the Louvre, and go make some paintings from the masters. Go do some copies. And he did just that. He went to the Louvre, saw all these other young artists copying the great masters, and he just decided to sit by the window and paint the outdoors. He said, no one could make me stick to the rules, even in my youngest days. And so, with that, he began a little business, even when he was just a teenager, of drawing these charcoal caricatures, mostly of people from Le Havre. And people were like lining up for these basically. They were paying him 10 francs, 20 francs. And he said, if I'd kept at it, I would have been a millionaire. Notice here too, the O Monet, the Oscar Monet here. So these were incredibly popular. And believe it or not, this would be pretty much the most financial stability that he has for the next few decades. Here we see him as a young man painted by the artist Carolus Duran. If you've been to some of my other art talks, you might recommend or you might recognize that name because he was also the master to young John Singer Sargent. So he was an important modern artist in France at the time, and poor Claude Monet. You can see him here as a young man. I don't think you necessarily get a sense of his life through a picture like this, but this is a young man who was always outrunning predators. He would literally go and spend the night at a hotel and then run out of the building before he had to pay the bill. And painting in a style that wasn't popular never helped his finances. So sadly for him, by the age of 28, all of this really caught up with him. He was in a very dark place, and believe it or not, Claude Monet tried to end his life by drowning himself in the River Seine, which is what we're looking at here in one of his very lovely paintings from just a few years later. This is a beautiful work that's in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's really hard to imagine that the river that kind of directed his life, that so often inspired him, could have ended him. And depression haunted him throughout his entire life. He said once, "Beyond painting and gardening, I am good for nothing." And even still, he was known to destroy his canvases if he was not satisfied with them. So, this man that created these light, bright, beautiful, airy, sort of weightless paintings was really bogged down with the weight of the world so often. Now, these next two images show, well, give us a little peek into his family life. We are looking at paintings of his first son. This is Jean over here, and on the right as well, and his first wife, Camille. He was married in 1870 at the age of 30. This was well, more on that marriage, more on Camille in just a moment. But I will say, in the early years, his family was often featured in his artwork. Let's fast forward about another decade. Here we have a self portrait by Monet. And this was right around the time he started to achieve real success and stability in his life. It's a real striking self portrait, isn't he? Um, at this point, he had moved from Paris. He's moved to the suburb of Giverny, and this is where he's beginning the Water Lily series, and he's celebrated. He's married again. His family is growing, and here he's middle aged. He's confronting us, the viewer, and it almost seems as though his eyes are watering, doesn't it? It almost seems like he's close to tears here. Notice that his face is half in shadow, half in light, and that might be because this is an artist who is always interested in light, but it if we wanted to get a little bit analytical here, this could be because he's telling us a little bit about the nature of himself, the nature of his personality here. This is a man who had a dark side. The troubled young man who tried to drown himself in the Seine has grown into a moody and melancholy adult here. Now, one of the greatest challenges he faced later on in life had to do with his eyesight, with his vision, which is devastating when it comes to the work of an artist. So, we're looking at two paintings here that were inspired by the Water Lily Garden, which was a source of joy and inspiration for him for decades. We're going to be spending a little bit more time with it tonight. But beginning in the early years of the 20th century, Monet began to show signs of vision impairment, and his perception of colors suffered. His broad brushstrokes became even broader. It was almost like he was searching for something in those brushstrokes. And what we'll see is that the canvases become really yellowed. He uses a lot of magentas and browns instead of like these cool colors that he's so closely associated with. And so, in an attempt to sort of combat what was happening with his vision, he tried to make adjustments just in terms of his habits. He would keep really strict order of his paints, and he would label them, and he would start off a painting with like an idea and try to match that in his mind, knowing that his perception of color couldn't help him to achieve what was in his mind. And he painted like that, believe it or not, for about a decade. Here's another example of one of these pictures that was so very much impacted by his vision impairment. So in 1823, he was, oh, sorry, I believe it was much earlier than that. I think at the beginning of the 19 teens, he was diagnosed as having nuclear cataracts in both eyes. And he resisted surgery. He didn't want to have surgery because other artists, including Mary Cassatt, had had cataract surgery at this right around this time and had gone completely blind. And he just did not want that fate. And so after a decade of painting like this, he finally relents to have surgery done in just one of his eyes. This is Monet recovering from that surgery. He actually said to his surgeon, "It was criminal to put me in this position." I think he was like a pretty cantankerous patient, but it was hard for him to be laid up and to not be able to see. But eventually, he did have full color restored to one eye, and he was able to paint in the style and the same colors as he is as he had been prior to his vision impairment. So, interestingly, it was said that he went back and destroyed a lot of those canvases that he created during that pre-operative period. So, just to wrap up quickly on Monet, like I said, we'll be getting a little bit deeper into him throughout the course of the evening. We can see him here as a man much later on in years. He actually died close to 100 years ago in 1926. And it's still just remarkable to me today that in 100 years, he still is the creator of such recognizable and such beloved images, not just in our culture, but worldwide today. I mean, a man of incredible vision and influence. So, where does all of that come from? We love to assign, genius to a singular artist, but what we're going to start off with today is looking at some of these important relationships that helped to form his artistic vision early on. So some of these friendships that spurred him on and helped um, to formulate sort of his approach to painting. So Monet met a number of young avant-garde painters when he was in art school studying to be a painter. And these well-dressed young men in their suits, I mean, we would hardly assume that they were avant-garde looking at them today, but they were very much so. This was a tight-knit group of young artists, really forward-thinking, most of them also painting outside on plein air. And they were really interested in exhibiting their work outside of these formal channels of selling art in France. So these revolutionary young artists, they would paint all day in their studio and then they'd come together at night at the cafes and talk about what they were doing. They were all living or working in this one district in Paris named Batignolles. So this is called a studio at Les Batignolles, and it was painted by an artist named Henri Fantin Latour. But importantly for us, the artist most celebrated here is not Monet, but Manet. He's like the senior artist here. He's like the grandfather to the movement in some ways. He's not that much older than everybody else. But Monet, our focus for tonight, is kind of standing in the back in the shadows. But these two artists, Manet and Monet, who were even in their lifetimes oftentimes mistaken for each other, they were instrumental in bringing all of these artists together. Cezanne, Renoir, I believe we can see Renoir right over here, Degas, Sisley, others, to these conversations. And Monet wrote, "Nothing could be more interesting than these talks with their perpetual debates. We encouraged each other to explore ideas and enthusiasms for weeks and weeks, supporting each other until the idea took a final shape. We always came out better tempered, more confident, with our thoughts clearer." So this was a really important system of support for this young artist who was, grappling with poverty and depression at this time. So I mentioned Manet. We've got our Manet, we've got our Monet, and though that relationship there is really important because, of course, Manet was doing things that influenced Monet. And I should mention too that Manet, the senior statesman of Impressionism, was really annoyed initially to oftentimes be mistaken for Monet. But he made a splash in 1863 with this painting called Luncheon on the Grass. The nude made a splash, the contemporary subject made a splash, but also the way it was painted. Notice this kind of sketchy quality, especially back here in the top right quadrant. And people said, what was this painted with a mop? And so to pay homage to this revolutionary work, Monet painted his own Luncheon on the Grass about 3 years later. And he wasn't going for scandal, although I do think it's interesting that he included this pile of clothes down here at the lower right, sort of reminds me of the pile of clothes that this woman has just taken off over here. But instead, we have very fashionably dressed ladies. We have a whole group that's around this picnic here in the woods. But the focus, the star of the show, is the light coming through the leaves of this tree and even dappling that picnic blanket that we see on the ground. So Monet is already kind of declaring who he is and what his interest is as an artist. So these artistic friendships continue to propel him. And I love these two works together. These are paintings by Monet on the left and by his friend Auguste Renoir on the right. And they are of the same subject, a place called the Grenouille, which was just out, a very fashionable restaurant just outside of Paris. This is like where a Parisian society was really hanging out in the summer. And these two artists just set up their easels side by side to paint society, really, to paint modern life unfolding in front of them. I love the details of the people swimming and boating in the water here, but the Grenouille, it roughly translates to the cheese wheel. So you have to imagine walking out on this little plank on either side to this little fake island and then walking up on another plank to get to this floating restaurant. And for Monet, his interest is the reflection of light off of the water primarily. Renoir is always much more interested in people and fashion. So he kind of zooms in and gives us a little taste of what society looks like there. Imagine just walking in a seaside town today and seeing two people side by side at easels and thinking maybe their work will be hung together in museums in 150 years or so. But these two artists working together were propelling each other on. And so many of these young impressionists were supporting each other, working together outside. I love this painting of Claude Monet in his little floating studio. This was painted by Edward Manet, again, the Monet Manet there. And we can see Monet's wife, Camille, in the background. We can see him presumably with his paint box, his paintbrush, working on this tiny little canvas here. If you're going to paint the River Seine, why not be on it? Monet returns the favor with this kind of muddy version or this muddy painting of Manet sitting at his easel over here. So all of these artists really aren't working independently. They're not cloistered away in their studios. They are sitting together. They're talking while they paint. They are sharing ideas all along the way. And as Monet gets a little bit older, younger artists are seeking him out to learn from him. Now he's become the elder statesman of French Impressionism. If you've been to my talks before, you've probably seen this painting here by the American expatriate artist John Singer Sargent, who went to Giverny to seek out Claude Monet. And here he is sitting alongside Claude Monet, trying out this style of these loose, kind of fluid brushstrokes here. And he paints Claude Monet at his own easel painting. Here's Claude Monet's wife over on the right. And there's just enough detail here that we even know what painting Monet was working on in this particular image. And what I always find kind of funny is that there is a tradition among artists is when you're sitting together and you paint each other that you would exchange those works as gifts. John Singer Sargent never gave this painting to Claude Monet. He kept it for himself. I think he was really proud to have made this connection, and he probably wanted to. It's like keeping an autograph or something or a photo with a celebrity. He kept it for himself. Now, we'll round out this quick section here with just two more paintings. And neither one of these are done by Claude Monet, but this is the Monet family that we're looking at. So this is Claude Monet over here on the far right, tending to his garden. There's chickens and roosters nearby. This is his wife sitting here with their oldest son, Jean, kind of leaning up against her. So the scenario here, we've got a Manet painting on the left, we've got a Renoir over here on the right. So even as Monet is up to other things, you know, he's doing the other things of life, his artist friends are still coming over to his house, setting up their easels and just deciding, we'll paint you and we'll just sit side by side doing this. In fact, we know that Manet had sat down and had planned to, he brought his paints, he planned to kind of make this informal painting, this sketch. And then Renoir just shows up and he starts borrowing materials and he creates this alternative view that we see over here on the right. So all of these artists are working so collaboratively together early on. What we're going to do now is shift our attention to this woman, Camille, who has shown her face in so many of these early works. And this leads us to our next section about love. So this is Camille Danciot. I'm just going to call her Camille Monet. She is the first Mrs. Monet, and she was a frequent model for the Impressionists. We see her here in a photograph in the left and an early Monet work on the right. She met Claude Monet in 1865, so he was just 25 years old at the time. She was 18, and by that point, she'd already been modeling for a number of the French Impressionist artists, but she quickly became his favorite model and then his lover. And Monet's family did not approve of this relationship at all. Um, they sort of forbade it. They said, if you're going to be with this young woman, we are not going to support you financially in any way. Um, so really Monet and Camille Monet had to live together in poverty when they decided to be together. And Monet was so continually inspired by her. He painted her at least 30 different times. And we don't think of him as being a figurative painter at all. We think of him as being a landscape painter, but his early images are dominated by her. So on the right, the woman in the green dress here, this was painted in 1866. It was exhibited at the Paris Salon, the big annual state-sponsored exhibition, and it got all of this great acclaim. Um, and we see this beautiful green dress, and that green is going to become a little bit of a signature for Monet. We see her skin kind of radiating against this dark background here. It doesn't look like a typical Monet at all, does it? I mean, it's we don't see those short, quick, broken brush strokes, but at this point, he's still kind of emulating Manet. And this is a work that we oftentimes think of as being a big transition away from Manet into Monet finding himself. And this is simply called Women in a Garden. It's from the following year, 1866. If you're dying to see it today, it's at the Musée d'Orsay. Camille posed for all four of these figures, and Monet painted it outside. It's a huge canvas. He actually dug a trough in the ground so he could move it up and down and try and sort of maintain the same vantage point. This was rejected from the salon. The judges did not like its narrative weakness, and they also didn't like his heavy brushstrokes here. They criticized that specifically, and of course, that would go on to be the characteristic of French Impressionism. This is where he was going in life. So even though this wasn't considered a success, he, of course, continues on with it. This is, I think, the summer of 66. By the winter of the following year, he's created this remarkable picture of Camille. And at this point, the two lovers are not yet married. They're living in poverty. They're stressed out young parents, and they've been shunned by Monet's family. Monet himself is in the depths of depression. And in this picture, he's just captured her walking outside in the snow on a cold winter's day. And she's so striking because she's got this red kerchief around her head. And in this moment, he's inside, she's outside, but their glances have connected. It's this momentary effect of that emotional recognition between these two. And probably for that reason, Monet decided to keep this work with him for the rest of his life. And as we'll learn, there are many works of Camille that were able to survive. And of course, that red kerchief around her head really sets her apart in this rather sort of muted color palette here. So we can see it's a dark time in his life. But oftentimes Camille kind of stands in for the things or stands in as an anchor in compositions for things that Monet loves. So over on the left, it's really a painting about all of these flowers that he's celebrating with these quick, short brushstrokes, the blues, the whites, the yellows here. It's just a riot of these colors. And if you just kind of cut this picture in half, it would be a completely abstract painting. But he's added in Camille here to give us a sense that we're looking at somebody's garden. Over on the right, a picture that's probably familiar to many of you because it's at the MFA in Boston. This is Camille posing in a Japanese kimono, and there's about a dozen Japanese fans behind her here. This is a good opportunity to note too that Claude Monet loved all things Japanese. Of course, at this time, trade routes had opened up between France and Japan, and France was just flooded with these Japanese woodblock prints. And artists, impressionist artists, post-impressionist artists, were riveted by their compositions, by particularly their compositions, but all aspects of Japanese culture. So we can see here that it's not just wearing the kimono; it's probably even referencing specific models wearing kimonos that influence that work that's at the MFA. But when it comes to Camille, perhaps the best loved image related to Camille, produced by Monet, is this one here from 1875. This is called Woman with a Parasol. And in this painting, he's captured this moment where Camille is at the top of this hill. She's surrounded by flowers and tall meadow grasses. And we can tell that it's a very windy day. Her dress is being blown to the left. Her veil is being blown to the right. Everything is sort of whipping around like a tornado. And then you've got this frenzy of Monet's brushstrokes in the clouds beyond. Of course, little Jean is just beyond her here. And it's such a striking, beautiful image that sort of transports you to a windy summer day like this that we can, I mean, we can see so clearly why Monet's works are so beloved with a work like this one. It's about capturing that color and light in such an exquisite way. Now, tragically, Camille passes away at the age of 32, shortly after the birth of their second son. She probably died from pelvic cancer, but it's kind of hard to know. So, a grieving Claude Monet painted this portrait of her for the very last time. This is Camille Claudel on, or Camille Monet on her deathbed from 1879. One art critic described the painting as a terrible blizzard of loss. There can be very few deathbed paintings which have been so intensely felt or objectively expressive. And Monet himself even wrote about how he was sort of transfixed by her face and he sort of started analyzing objectively how the colors were playing across his forehead. I'm just going to chalk that up to, his version of grief there, but he felt compelled to make this picture of her. And he just kept on painting for the rest of his life. And you might be thinking, how did he keep going on? He had two little boys, he has his family. Well, this is where things get interesting. Stay with me here. Okay. So Claude Monet, just about a year or two before Camille passes away, Claude Monet and Camille Monet move in with another family, a family by the name of Ochede, Ernest and Alice. And Ernest was a department store owner, an art collector, but he had gone bankrupt. So these two families really needed each other. The Monets have two kids, the Audeches have six. So eight kids altogether, two families in this one house. And then, of course, Camille passes away, and Ernest sort of moves out of the picture. He starts living away from the family, trying to make his own fortune, and eventually he passes away. And so you probably see where things are going here. At that point, Claude and Alice get together. So these two families that had already been living together, and there was even some speculation that Alice's youngest child was actually fathered by Claude. We don't really know when the relationship started. Some art historians even say that it was before Camille passed away. So, so you might think, okay, well, these sorts of things happen. Here is Alice Audiche and the new Mrs. Monet. Here is a big family portrait. We can see Claude Monet in the background here. This is Alice in front of him. These are their two youngest boys who are just about the same age, and some of their older kids. Alice was apparently very jealous and dictated that all images of Camille and her letters be destroyed. I think Claude Monet was only able to keep one photograph of his first wife. So after that, okay, so we have these two families that have come together, and then Alice. Oh, I should mention too. Then one of Claude Monet's sons, his oldest son Jean, actually ends up marrying one of Alice's daughters. That's Blanche over here. So, so they weren't biologically related, but they're step siblings and they get married. But after some time, about a decade, Jean Monnet passes away, Alice passes away, and you can probably see where this is going now. Then it is rumored that Claude Monet takes up with Blanche Audiche, who was his stepdaughter and former daughter-in-law. And it depends on who, like which resource you go to. Some just described Blanche as somebody who took care of Claude Monet in his later years. Some people describe it as a love affair. We do know that Claude Monet and Blanche Audiche shared a passion for painting. She was an artist in her own right, and what we're looking at here is a painting by Monet of Blanche painting in the woods outside of their home at Giverny. So a really interesting sort of Woody Allen family dynamic for Claude Monet, especially later on in life. Okay, so, so now we're going to shift gears and get to what really Claude Monet is probably best celebrated for, and that is his preoccupation with light. And this really begins in the 1890s. This is when he gets into his series, a similar subject from different vantage points. This is really all about momentary effects and changes in light. And it's interesting now as we head into this section because now he doesn't have the stability of his marriage to Camille. He has really kind of moved away from those early friendships, but he's found himself and his mode of expression at this point. So we are of course looking at four paintings from the famous Haystack series, which was painted 1890 to 1891. There's 25 paintings total in the series that were painted in less than a year. And I can't emphasize to you enough how boring and mundane of a subject the haystacks were. Properly, they should be called wheat stacks because this was wheat for eating that was covered in hay. This is a very particular arrangement of these haystacks, and they would have just been harvested and then left for a long time in order to be processed. So he would go out at different times of the day, different times of the year in order to capture them in, you know, the first light of the day, in the last light of the day. And it wasn't that he was dashing off these pictures so quickly. It was that he was working on so many of these paintings simultaneously. In fact, Blanche, his daughter-in-law, stepdaughter, was actually carting out canvases for him in wheelbarrows so he could paint on like four to eight different canvases simultaneously. So if he'd already established this composition and the light was exquisite, he could go right into it. And so this is where we get to Monet's philosophy around this. He would say, try to forget the objects that you have before you, a tree, a house, a field, whatever. Merely think, here's a little square of blue, here's an oblong of pink, here's a streak of yellow, and paint it just as it looks to you, the exact color and shape until it gives you your own impression of the scene before you. And this is where Claude Monet found his success. This was exhibited, people went wild over it, they sold really well, and so now he's got some stability and some success under his art. This was a breakthrough too, and a revolutionary in French art. I mean, prior to this, nobody would have really thought that haystacks were a great subject for the history of art, but Claude Monet is saying, the subject doesn't even matter. It is this intention and approach to painting light. And the kicker here is that you kind of need to see them all together in order to really appreciate it. And of course, these collections have all been split up here. So what we're going to do is turn our attention very quickly to another series by Claude Monet. That's the Rouen Cathedral paintings. There's 30 of these in total. This is the subject that he explored most in depth beyond the water lilies. These were made in 1892 to 93. He actually rented a studio space just across the square from the Rouen Cathedral, painted it sort of morning, noon, and night, as we can see here, and essentially builds up these pictures with so much paint, such a thick impasto there, that art historians have even likened the thickness of that paint to the stonework of the actual cathedral, even though that stonework sort of seems to dissolve and fade away in the different atmospheres of the day. This was considered a particularly patriotic subject matter for him to paint because, French Gothic architecture was like this huge, an enormous success for French culture. So even at the time, people were saying, "Don't split up the series. The French state should buy it." But of course, that's not what happened. So you have to go to different museums in order to see these all together. He also painted poplars. He had a number of series. Most people aren't familiar with all of them. We can't touch on all of them tonight, but the poplars were painted in 1891. He was out in one of his floating studios in order to capture them. He was just sort of entranced by these tall, skinny trees. Before he was done with the series, the owner of these poplars decided that they were just going to auction them off, like cut them down and sell them for lumber. So Claude Monet had to buy them so that he could finish his paintings, and then eventually he just sold them to a lumberyard too. But we can see again the his ability to capture this subject, this natural subject too, in different qualities of light, different times of day. Now, interestingly, he kind of started doing his series in an industrial space, in a very modern space, the Gare Saint Lazare, which is the Saint Lazare train station. And if you think about it, it makes total sense because this is an artist who was interested in momentary effects of light and shadow. And the steam of these trains was constantly changing the atmosphere inside the train station. He was working very closely with the director of the train station in order to paint this setting. And apparently, at one point, he even asked to kind of coordinate the release of steam from multiple engines just to kind of flood the place with steam. One critic even wrote, the poetry of the 19th century is steam. So I think that's what drew him to this. It's not always considered a true series from Monet because he actually uses different vantage points in pictures other than this one. But here we get the sense that he's drawn to the same subject. He wants to paint it at different times of day and capture different qualities of light here. He also moved outside of the boundaries of France too. He loved England, and he would oftentimes travel there to paint the Waterloo Bridge, which we see in different effects of time of day and atmosphere. I just particularly love the light shining off of this top right one over here, the steam kind of coming over the top of the bridge down below on the left. He had this one hotel room that he would always stay in order to get the same vantage point. And these sort of remind me of Impression Sunrise, that first stab that he had at impressionistic painting. And if you're so inclined to do kind of a Claude Monet tour, you can go to England and stay in the exact same hotel room at the Savoy. For some reason, it used to be called the Monet Suite, and now it's just called the Personality Suite with the river view, and get that exact same perspective that he had when he was there. So if you're going to travel to see Claude Monet, it's probably not the Waterloo Bridge that's going to move you. I would highly recommend starting with the flowers and heading to Giverny first. Okay, so let's focus our attention in our last few minutes here on Claude Monet as a gardener and Claude Monet as a painter of that garden. We can see him here at about middle age, standing in one of his gardens at a rented property. And this is a picture or a painting of one of his gardens at a rented property in Vautoy from 1881. And even at this rented property, I mean, we have like these towering sunflowers, we've got the tall grasses in the ginger jars in the foreground. I think we would all love to just spend a day in like this sun-drenched view that he's created here. It's just absolutely magnificent. Claude Monet said that gardening was a profession that he learned to take on in his youth when he was unhappy. So he was always sort of trying to find his way emotionally in tending to a garden. And I think you could probably extend that to painting gardens as well. So in 1883, he is able to purchase this unbelievable house in Giverny, which was a charming little village about 40 miles outside of Paris. He was 43 at the time, so exactly the midpoint of his life. And for the next 43 years, he is going to be inspired by this property. In Giverny, he found sort of the solitary retreat that he'd always been looking for. And doesn't it look like a little slice of heaven? Don't we all just want to move to Giverny right now? So he was able to afford this property based off of the success of some of those early series that he was doing, like the Haystacks. At this point, he was already living there, but he didn't own the house. And once he owned it, he immediately started making changes to the gardens, to these flower beds that we see here, and he's asking Alice to help him and Alice's children. And one of the first things that he did actually was paint the shutters of the house to this color green. In fact, the people of Giverny began to refer to it as a Monet green. And it kind of reminds me of that green dress that Camille was wearing in one of his very first paintings of her. And I always wonder if it's his way of kind of paying homage to her and that early happiness that he had. So he doesn't just stop with the shutters. So like I said, he's tearing up these gardens and he's planting flowers. He got rid of the vegetables, the apple orchards, and instead it's irises, it's daylilies, it's tulips, it's Japanese peonies. We're looking at a colorized a picture of Monet in that garden. Look at the house itself too. Just it looks like it's alive. It's just covered with these vines and greenery. It's like a full extension of his garden. Now, this is the primary garden pathway leading to the house. They added these arches to it and grew I think wisteria in over those arches. And so it's called, the arched garden pathway here. And if we're looking down at the property, there's that arched garden pathway. There's the house at the top of the slide here. And you can see these formal gardens with the rectilinear lines, some greenhouses, a studio over here. Well, eventually, Claude Monet is able to acquire the property just on the other side of this road. And that is, of course, where he is able to build his water lily garden. It's a construction. It's his idea, it's his fantasy. He's able to divert this little waterway in order to create this water lily pond. He constructs these paths that kind of meander around, hugging the contours of that pond. So we've gone to from rectilinear to something that's curvilinear. It's a completely different landscape. It's dreamy, it's romantic, moving away from everything that's sort of regimented there. And of course, that water lily pond would be the source of his inspiration in terms of his paintings for years to come. He even builds the Japanese footbridge here. It's this arched little footbridge, which are traditionally painted red if you're looking at Japanese culture, but he painted it that green, the same as the shutters, the same as Camille's dress from that early painting too. This painting over here on the left is at the National Gallery of Art. So here is a present day view of the gardens, which have been beautifully restored. And we can see that it's just this rich mix of textures, of colors. And a lot of the color is produced from the greenery, not from the flowers. It's sort of like he wanted to allow for those water lilies to be the stars of the show. And he would import these water lilies from Africa, from South America. Over the years, he added things like bamboo and rhododendron and cherry trees and all of that, but it really kind of started off with the greenery. And it created this beautiful, tranquil place for him to paint. You can almost think of him as a collaborator with nature. He wanted to paint it, but he also wanted to shape it, right? Now, you might be thinking, how on earth did he have the time to do this? How can he paint everything and then also maintain these gardens? Well, he had six gardeners under his employ who were able to realize his vision for him. We're looking at two of his famous water lily paintings here. He said, "Everything I have earned has gone into these gardens. My gardens are my most beautiful work of art." When he wanted to paint his water lilies, he would actually send one of his gardeners out on a boat into the pond, and he would dip each one of these water lilies into the water to clean them off because there was so much dust from a nearby road. So much dust that eventually Monet paid out of his own pocket to pave that road so that the dirt wouldn't impact his water lily garden. He would spend up to 40,000 francs a year on greenhouses, on heating, these creating heating systems for his water lilies. He poured everything into this garden. And here is another sort of early water lily painting where we can see that his focus is sort of the surface of the water here. He provides an edge where we can see the greenery at the edge of the pond, but with the focus on the surface of the water, we get the reflection of the sky above. We have the mirror-like surface here where we have just the water lilies resting upon that, and then even the suggestion of what's below the surface as well. So you have a whole world from sky to below water encapsulated in these paintings, and that sort of shifts over time. What he begins to do is omit any kind of framing device in these compositions. So there's no water's edge here. And instead, the paintings kind of flatten out. I mean, you do get this, we understand that there's a sense of perspective leading our eye back in both of these pictures, but there's really, this is kind of paving the way for 20th century artists like Picasso and even Jackson Pollock to just think of pictures as being rather flat. With these two works, we can see that he also, with the water lilies, worked on multiple canvases simultaneously. This is almost the exact same composition, but it's a dramatically different time of day, dramatically different quality of light with these two works here. And then eventually, art historians would say that he essentially inverts landscapes. Eventually, his sky is at the bottom, his greenery is at the top, simply because of the reflections of his water lily pond. He didn't know it, like I said, but he's really paving the way for all of this radical innovation of the 20th century. So, in his later years, his water lilies become really abstract. He's using bigger, broader brushstrokes in order to just suggest the forms of those water lilies sitting on top of the surface of the water there. And I should mention that in 1909, Monet had his first exhibit of water lily paintings, and it was met with resounding acclaim and success. Gone were the days of people going and getting violent at his exhibition openings. He was at this point just renowned as France's greatest painter, not to mention France's greatest gardener. So we see him here in his studio, actually, because it's very well known that he would start these paintings by his water lily gardens, but he would end them in his studio. And he would work up to like 60 different sessions per painting. I mean, we think of him as being prolific with these water lilies. He's working on them for decades, but he really only produced about 250 water lily paintings because he kind of overworked them. Sometimes there's like 15 layers of paint with these water lily paintings. And he would get super frustrated and angry as he's painting them, sometimes slashing the paintings, destroying them if they didn't meet his satisfaction in the process. Now, at the very end of his life, he decides to take on water lilies on a grand scale. And I'm sure you've probably all seen at some point a picture of Claude Monet standing in front of these massive paintings. Some of them are as tall as 6 feet and as long as about 55 feet. This project was called the Grand Decorations. They were monumental canvases of his water lily garden, which were sort of like a grand finale in his career. They were meant to be about the symbiosis between his water lily gardens and his paintings. So he executed these works in the midst of World War One, where he's just feeling angry and frustrated that he couldn't be contributing to the war effort in a more meaningful way. But he decided this was the ultimate expression of his patriotism. And he decided to donate these works to the French state. He did that on the day of the armistice in 1918. So this was like a dedication to peace, essentially. And the gift of these massive panels were to be installed shortly after his death, and that's exactly what happened. So almost about a decade later. So if you wanted to see these huge paintings, which are known as sort of like the Sistine Chapel of Impressionist painting, you would go to the Orangerie in Paris. And on the second floor, there are these two elliptical galleries that were sort of designed, planned by Claude Monet to exhibit these massive, long, like 55-foot long canvases, these like views of his water lily garden in 360 degrees. It's as though he's gifted to the world the serenity of that garden, the joy of that garden in his life. Um, it was like his greatest pride. And I will indulge a very silly theory to just to round things off. There is speculation that there's actually a self-portrait of Claude Monet in the clouds of this top picture over here. It's right over here. And so we'll just sort of do a side by side here where, this could be his eyes, this would be like the top of his head and the beard down below. Who knows if that was intentional? But if we're calling it the Sistine Chapel of Impressionism, we know that Michelangelo put his own self-portrait in the Sistine Chapel. So why wouldn't Claude Monet? So just a very quick conclusion as we wrap up tonight. Claude Monet passed away in 1926 due to lung cancer. And as he knew in that final year that he was declining, his best friend, the former prime minister of France, Georges Clemenceau, wrote to Monet and said, "What more could one ask for? You've had the best life a man could dream of." And Clemenceau was by his side when the artist passed away. And famously at Monet's funeral, when they draped his casket with a black cloth, which was customary, Clemenceau went over, pulled the black cloth over, and said, "No black for Monet," and put instead like floral curtains over his casket. So these days, Claude Monet's water lily gardens have been beautifully restored. They were reopened. Well, they were opened to the public in 1980, and at this point, about 500,000 people go to the small town of Giverny to see them for themselves while they're open about 7 months a year. And as I said, Monet said, "My garden is my most beautiful work of art." Here's just his interpretation of those gardens one last time. So I'll give Monet the final word in today's program. He said, "People discuss my art and pretend to understand as if it were necessary to understand, when it's simply necessary to love." So I will end it there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about Claude Monet. I'm sorry we went a little bit long tonight. Start looking at the Q&A here and then the chat. Someone asked, "What is the name of the museum in Paris where the first painting on the overview page can be found?" That's called the Marmottan. Let's see if I can type that in here. I might have to put that into the chat. Marmatton. That's where you can see a lot of Claude Monet's work. His younger son, Michel, inherited almost I said essentially the whole estate, and he passed away in 1966, and I believe his will had bequeathed most of Monet's work to the Marmottan by that point. And where was that first exhibition of Monet and the others? Ooh, the exact location? That's a very good question, anonymous attendee. I'm not sure off the top of my head. Let's see if it's in my notes. It's generally just referred to as the First Impressionist exhibition. I'm not sure if I have the location in my notes. It was in Paris. They at that point they weren't the Impressionists, so it was known as the Anonymous Society of Painters, Sculptors, and Printmakers. But the location, I'm sorry, I don't have in my notes. I'm sure we could track that down easily though. And somebody else asked, did Monet live in the Flower House alone? No, so he lived there with Alice Audiche and then her family as well. And then after Alice passed away, with Blanche, and others from the Audiche family. Elizabeth asks, has the stolen Impression Sunrise ever been found? Great question. I don't have that at the I didn't look into that before I prepared for tonight's talk. So many works by Monet have been stolen. Some were looted by the Nazis during World War II. That particular work, I don't know the status of, Elizabeth, but thanks for asking that. I will try to delve into that just to be better prepared the next time I give this one. Let's see. I'm going to go back to the chat here and just see if there's any questions in the chat. Um, JD says, were there any innovations, improvements in paintbrushes along with the invention of paint tubes? Great question. That's something I never even considered. I'd have to look into it. Thanks for asking it. It's got me thinking about all of this in a new way. I wonder if they were being mass produced now, maybe easier to acquire in the same way. That's a great question. Rocco says, were there forerunners of French Impressionists in other countries of Europe? Great question, Rocco. Monet had spent time in England. He was very much influenced by JMW Turner and Constable, who were English painters who were already doing this kind of loose thing with their brushwork, but not quite French Impressionism. So that's one instance that stands out to me. There's probably plenty of others. Elaine asks, why did his family forbid the relationship between Monet and Camille? I think she just wasn't high enough class, this young teenager working as a model for these revolutionary artists. That's not who they envisioned their young son to be with. I think it was a class issue. Um, and Tamara says, please let the audience know that the MFA in Boston is one of the largest collections of Monet paintings outside of France. Thanks for adding that. Nancy says, oh, going back to the MFA. Oh, directions there. Larry, I'm glad you like the Woody Allen reference because that's actually my dad's joke. I had to throw it in there tonight. Michelle, I have to give my dad credit too. Definitely want to check out the collection soon. Oh, and the river cruises, right? There's so many. We all need to go on one of these river cruises now. Ed Harris played Monet. Oh, yeah, wow. I didn't even know that. We're gonna have to look up Ed Harris. Apparently, he's like this master actor when it comes to artists because he did Pollock and he did Pollock so beautifully. Um, Let's see here. Wow, somebody was just at the Claude Monet house 3 weeks ago. It stays with you, doesn't it? If you haven't been, everyone, please add it to your list, the top of your list. And Amy adds, yep, even on a rainy day, the gardens were spectacular. Thank you for the kind words that are coming in. James says some decades ago, the house had fallen into repair in the gardens. And an American had had saved them. The name escapes you. The name escapes me too. I'd have to look into that. I think I just did like a superficial look at the restoration of the gardens, but there's also a little museum of American Impressionists there, if I'm remembering correctly. So America sort of looms large in Giverny. Um, Everybody, thank you for your kind words. Let's see. Carlos, thanks for your kind words and building in the post impressionists who we didn't even touch on. I mean, you could do a whole other presentation on just the influence of Claude Monet. Um, I'm glad it seems like tonight people connected with, learning a little bit about him and learning so much about his paintings. So I'm glad people enjoyed this. Oh, thank you so much for these kind words. All right, I'm copying and pasting all of it. I think I got to most of the questions here, Gianna. Um, yes.
Awesome. All
Thank you
right,
so much, everyone.
everyone. Well, thank you so, so much for joining us tonight. And of course, thank you, Jane, as always, for this great presentation. I do want to let folks know a couple things. So first and foremost, this was a recorded presentation. So as long as you are registered, you should be receiving an email, hopefully sometime tomorrow or early next week with the recording. So be sure to take a look out for that. And then also, please be sure if you're interested in next month's presentation, you can register at the library website. We do have a blog post on there that has all of the upcoming presentations and all of the registration links. If you need any help with that, you can always call the library as well. We're more than happy to do that for you. And next month in May, it's going to be on May 30th at 7 p.m. on Zoom, Maxfield Parish, Myth and Whimsy. So please join us for that. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Have a great
Bye,
night. Thanks for your
everyone.
kind words.